ESPN analyst Louis Riddick recently appeared on the Dolphins Talk podcast and talked about where things have gone awry for the Miami Dolphins. And his insight is everything you need to know about why this offseason went the way that it did.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and NFL staff writer for A to Z Sports. Want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today on the show, we're going to get into some of the comments that were made by ESPN's Louis Riddick in an appearance on the Dolphins Talk podcast, which I want to first and foremost tip my cap to Marissa Marino, who conducted the interview with Louis. It's about 30 minutes long. It's over on the Dolphins Talk. I believe it's on their podcast feed, but also on their YouTube channel. Can't recommend you guys enough. Take a look at it and carve a little bit of time out of your day to hear what Louis, who's a super bright mind, great insight, personnel background. He's been in media for the past decade plus. So I know there's some Dolphins fans that hear the name Louis Riddick and say, I want Louis as the next GM of the team. And I don't know that I go that far just because Louis hasn't been in that side of the business. But there's no question the football ideology that Louis Riddick applies from a team building perspective and the belief that he has in some core principles that the Dolphins are currently bought into makes the kinds of things that he has to say and the insight that he provides the kind that were aesthetically pleasing to hear for a lot of Dolphins fans all over the place. But Louis hopped on and did this interview with Marissa over on Dolphins Talk. And they talked about Mike McDaniel. They talked about the trench play, the team culture, where the team is at. And they got into the culture thing a pretty good bit. And there was one thing in particular that Louis got into during his conversation with Marissa that really popped to me. And it was a quote that really ties into something that I felt, I've communicated, but Louis communicated it much more eloquently than I ever could. And it's a nice affirmation of one of the things that I think I've struggled with where this Dolphins team has gone the last couple of years. And it goes back to that idea that the Dolphins lost the plot, right? The Dolphins kind of lost their way with what this was supposed to be. The opportunities became exciting and there was a surplus and you talked yourself into, oh, we've drafted by volume. So we have an opportunity to add a Tyreek Hill, a Bradley Chubb, a Jalen Ramsey. And that those moves have come at the expense of the lifeblood, to borrow the phrase from Ravens general manager Eric DaCosta, the lifeblood of your organization is draft capital, right? And that's the stance that I've had as we watched this season past get off the rails is the Dolphins kind of lost their way with when they committed to doing the rebuild in 2019. And that chapter of the organization, make no mistake about it, is closed. There was a different head coach. They've gone through a full life cycle. They're beginning the next transition into the next life cycle. And it's really, this year is about getting the clarity on, are the people who are here the people you want to conduct the next 5-6 year life cycle of your organization, or are they not? And that's kind of how I've interpreted what their approach and maintaining. But Stephen Ross putting out a statement that talks about, stability not to be confused with content with the status quo, because the status quo is not good enough, right? And that was the statement that came out at the end of the year. But when you consider the transition that the Dolphins are in and why you hit a glass ceiling last time, you kind of lost some optimal years within that build because you changed head coaches halfway through, but you made it harder on yourself to make the jump at the big opportunity, right? I want to read the quote that Louis Riddick had about the culture thing and how you instill culture. And Louis really came out and said, I believe culture is a locker room instilled by the players in the locker room type of mentality. And that's been something that Mike McDaniel's caught some flack for being a player-oriented locker room. But that doesn't absolve the leadership of this organization from why the culture has perceived to have failed the team when you consider what Louis Riddick had to say. And I agree with it, right? The players set the culture, but who brought in the players? Here's what Louis Riddick had to say. I think culture can be very much so about momentum. You get enough players who really buy into the colors, the tradition, the way of doing things, and really want to take the message that's delivered from Mike, your head coach, and really want to disseminate that throughout the locker room and have it translate onto the football field. You got to have enough of those guys who really believe, who are really bought in. And right now, it sounds like there's not enough of that. There's not enough of that homegrown, I really do represent the Miami Dolphins type of culture down there. And you can think about last year's squad, even the players who were successes. And this kind of ties into some of the things that I heard were going on behind the scenes as far as players being able to communicate with one another at the early portion of the season. And it's a lot of new, and you got new players coming in, and players don't know how to handle, I don't even say confrontation, but just communication with each other about corrective measures for things that didn't go right. And people get sensitive about it, and people get hostile about it. And when you're wading into that kind of stuff because people had all these different formational experiences in different teams that they've been in, it created this grand chemistry experiment that, generally speaking, even for the players who you view as success stories for Miami, they struggled through that last season with all of the new and all of the placeholders. And that's not to say you can't have successes in free agency. And that's what Louis Riddick also mentioned, and we're going to get into next. But that really resonates for me in your roster turnover and this embracing of 40% of roster turnover on an annual basis. It might be factual for a lot of teams and on average, but if you can cut that number down and create more of a nucleus of established and pre-existing talent, you're not exposed to some of those things. And you're not exposed to some of those things. And the best way to create a pre-existing talent of sustainable year-over-year nucleus is those draft picks that we talked about. So we're going to get a little bit more into the culture thing, how free agency can work, some players that were a part of this problem from 2024. And then we're going to get into why the approach this offseason was the only way to go, in my opinion. And maybe I would have leaned into it a little bit more with some numbers about some of that draft capital. So that's next here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you guys stick with us. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings account or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, your investments, and spending all in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. For me, it was the monthly breakdown of the micro transactions on a day-by-day basis and seeing how all of those added up that helped me kind of recalibrate my plan on a monthly basis and get me financially moving towards a more efficient month-to-month operation. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNFL for half off of your first year. So the Dolphins have had some success stories in free agency, and the Dolphins, I think when you look at how they conducted this year in free agency, it was kind of out of line with what everybody expected because you were expecting a little bit more sense of I don't say panic, but a more prominent sense of spending urgency because you perceive people's jobs are on the line. I think what they did was the proper way. It more closely echoes and mirrors some of those sustained annual contenders, teams like the Baltimore Ravens. They're traditionally not very active in free agency. They like to draft by volume. The Dolphins drafted by volume this year. They like to selectively go after role players and then take care of their own. We're still waiting to see if the Dolphins are going to take care of any of their own. But you contrast that to last year, right, where Jordan Poyer's brought in. And Jordan Poyer's brought in with an expectation that he's going to be a leader and a tone setter and a culture driver for good for the Dolphins in their secondary. Well, Jordan Poyer, the season plays out, and Jordan doesn't play great. And he said on Good Morning Football that he knew he didn't play great, but he also said that the team didn't play well, and he didn't feel the connection with his teammates in Miami to put his body on the line that a way that he would have when he were playing with his teammates in Buffalo. Okay, there's just one problem with that, and that's like Jordan Poyer was brought into Miami to be that person and that player, but he didn't have that connection with the players. Now, Jordan Brooks brought in, and Jordan, kind of wears his heart on his sleeve. He told everybody what he thought after the Green Bay game. Played tough, played hard, played good football all season long. It looks like a hit. Aaron Brewer looks like a hit. Teron Armstead looks like a hit. Well, obviously, Teron riding off into the sunset, but when you signed him 3 years ago, he was everything you hoped he would be. So it's not a blanket statement to say you can't spend on free agents, right? But when you consider Tyreek Hill and Jalen Ramsey and even Bradley Chubb, and I think Bradley Chubb from a culture perspective is the kind of person you want at the forefront of your locker room. But Bradley Chubb said himself that missing last season, it was different and difficult to be the hands-on leader that he is accustomed and wanted to be when you're not in the trenches with the guys for yourself. So that's not to say Bradley Chubb. I think Bradley Chubb is not a welcomed presence or that he was a bad investment for a leadership and a culture perspective, but you can't impress leadership the way that you want when you're not on the field. And Bradley himself said that in OTAs. And you knew that the injury history with Bradley Chubb was a thing that existed. And you take that first round draft pick and the Tyreek Hill draft choices and the Jalen Ramsey third round draft choice and all of the money that those guys got. And then those guys, two of those three guys got new contracts again that re-upped and re-guaranteed more money. And the opportunity cost for those guys is where you were tapped for depth because it put more of a microscope on all of the draft investments you did make. It put more of a microscope on some of your depth players when those players that you brought in missed time. Corner with Ramsey the first half of 23. Wide receiver after Jalen Waddle when Tyreek Hill got banged up towards the end of the year. The edge group the entirety of last year and in the end of 2023 when you got a first-round pick guy in Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb and the guys behind that were either banged up or guys you signed off the street, right? It all adds up and compounds. But the Dolphins have had their fair share of hits in free agency. I think where I go to with this idea is what Mike Vrabel did a media show with the New England media when he became the head coach. And he talked about really two waves of the first wave of free agency. And it's the guys who signed for green. And then it's the guys who sign because they want the right fit and the right opportunity to be the best versions of themselves as players. And that's why I don't think it's a coincidence that, Aaron Brewer and Jordan Brooks and Jonnu Smith, those were guys that were not part of that legal tampering window or market reset dollars or crazy overspends. They came here because they were perceived as good fits to play their best football, and that matters. And that's where Louis Riddick talking about free agents that do come in, he said it's not to say that you can't have free agents who also buy into those types of things that you're trying to instill from that culture perspective that he was talking about. It's a little bit harder sometimes when you have guys and you bring them in from the outside, when you have free agents and bring them in from the outside and they're used to doing things a certain way. And maybe it's just not the way that they're used to doing it. It's not the way that they were brought up in the game of doing it. It's hard to keep them locked in. So I think about Jalen Ramsey and this Jalen Ramsey situation in its entirety right now, and a willingness to let a player go in light of the friction that it's causing in the locker room and between some of the players and the player leadership, and the player in question and the player and the coaches and the scheme and all of the distractions that are a part of that. Ramsey marches to the beat of his own drum, and he always has. And Jalen Ramsey chose to come here and then got 2 contracts in 2 years and now is choosing to leave. Right? So, and he does things the way that he wants to do things. And you contrast that to young guys like how Teron Armstead talks about Patrick Paul, right? How all the edge guys are now talking about Chop Robinson and leaning into another draft class of that's more of a high volume draft class. All of that adds up. You bring these guys into the league and you choose them because of not just the players that they are, but the human beings that they are. And it allows you to be the one as the leadership of the organization to indoctrinate them on, this is how we do things here. This is the right way to do things, as compared to bringing somebody that got that indoctrination from somebody else into your locker room and expecting them to fit in, especially if they're in that first legal tampering phase of free agency, where you talk to the agents and you agree upon a dollar amount and you put pen and paper and that's it. Like, it's very hard to find players that fit what you're trying to curate and cultivate in your locker room if you live in that end of the pool. And the Dolphins, obviously, they a number of their big investments that kind of cost them significant draft choices didn't necessarily come on the open market with this frenetic building, but they were players that existed somewhere else, were a part of a program somewhere else. And that's why when I look at what they did this year in the offseason with ancillary role players that have a very hyper-specific role to fill, by and large, with the exception of James Daniels and Zach Wilson as the backup quarterback, with something to prove, right? They're hungry. They're young and hungry. You look at what that brings to the table and then a focus on the NFL draft with those players with at least 4 years of cost control talent and bringing them into the league to be the ones that kind of get them into a system and have buy-in. And from Dante Trader to Jordan Phillips to Kenneth Grant to Ollie Gordon, you hear all these guys, the reviews of the workers that they are. And it's the players that get you excited in that regard for the work ethic that they bring to the table as mature young men who can handle a individual driven locker room with player leadership. The pieces of the puzzle fit. It's more so just a matter of how much success can you have in 2025 and how legitimate is the pressure that you might be facilitated to make organizational changes if it doesn't go well in 2025. But I don't think throwing more money at more free agents that did things in different places to come in, especially in the rat race of free agency, to fix your problems. All of their best hits were guys that took their sweet old time to sign because it was the right fit and the right opportunity and with the right players around them here in the locker room. And they've had hits in free agency. But not having the big eyes for the next shiny object that comes along the pipe. Like some of the draft capital elements of this are really jarring when you sit down and look at it. We're going to get into that next here. Locked on Dolphins. Make sure you guys stick with us. Guys, you've probably heard of Viagra and Cialis, and maybe you've even tried them for yourself. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet Rugiet Ready. Rugiet Ready is a next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiet's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast, on average in just 15 minutes. Effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control when the moment is right. If traditional options haven't worked for you, Rugiet might be the answer, and over 150,000 men have already made the switch. Head to Rugiet.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL to get 15% off today. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing review. Please visit the Rugiet website for full safety information. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I expect the Dolphins to have 3 first-round draft picks every year. I understand that is an unrealistic ask on my part. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to set the over-under at 6.5 comments about the hair. And I got called Mullet Boy by Drew recently. Cut your hair. It's down today. It's been up as of late, but it's down today. So I just happened to catch a glimpse of it here on the screen. And I said, I'm going to get an earful from you guys for that. But if I set the over-under at 8.5 draft picks in a 2-year window, and I said, would you take the over or under on 8.5 draft picks combined in 2 years? You would all say the over, right? You would want more than 8.5 draft picks. Well, the Dolphins made 8 draft picks in 2022 and 2023 combined. I just want to read through the numbers, okay? The Dolphins in 2020 and 2021, the formational years of the build, made 5 first-round draft picks. They made an additional 6 picks in the top 100. So it's a total of 11 draft choices in the top 100 in 2020 and 2021 combined. Mind you, in the midst of this process, they also had the 2 extra first-round picks that they recouped from the San Francisco 49ers as a part of the trade down from number 3 overall. In the next 2 years, 2022 and 2023, they went from making 11 picks in the top 100 to making 2 in a 2-year span. They made less total picks in 2 years than they made in the top 100 by almost 50%. Just an astronomical nosedive in the amount of draft capital that you put in, right? And 22 was Channing Tindall, who was not a top 100 pick, Eric Ezukam at 125, Cam Good, Skylar Thompson in the 7th round. 2023 was Cam Smith, Devon Achane, Elijah Higgins, Ryan Hayes. Higgins looking like a good pick. He doesn't make your roster. That 2-year sample size had 2 players in rounds 4, 5, and 6 as well. Eric Ezukama and Elijah Higgins. So we were at a point where the conversation last year was the Dolphins don't get hits on day 3. And it's like, well, they haven't made any draft picks on day, because you include 2021. They made 2 in the first, 2 in the second, 1 in the third, and then none until the 7th round. So they had a 3-year stretch where they made 2 picks between rounds 4, 5, and 6. 3 years. And you want to act like they don't have hits on day 3. That's why they don't have hits on day 3, because they're picking in the 7th round or not at all. And you get up to this year's, the 2024 class, Jalen Wright showing potential. Muhammad Kamara, who knows? Malik Washington showing potential as a role player at the very least. Patrick McMorris had an awesome preseason. Those were all players picked in rounds 4, 5, or 6. You had 2 picks in a 3-year stretch in that window. You made more picks in rounds 4, 5, and 6 in 2024 than you made in the previous 3 years combined. And then you add in this year, Phillips, Marshall, Trader, Gordon, all in rounds 4, 5, and 6. 5th and 6th round, technically. those are some of the best value contracts in football if you get hits, and you get hits for very specific roles. And the reason why some of those players become really good hits is if you have enough continuity and you get enough stable talent in place and enough cornerstone players that you can tether your identity to, you go shopping for role players that can then maybe develop into something more. And that's what I look at. Joe Marino and I just today, we did the Tampa Bay Buccaneers draft history with Jason Light as the general manager. Jason Light got a contract extension today with the Buccaneers. That was announced today that he had gotten a contract extension, which is very well deserved. He's one of the best executives in football. But you look at some of their draft targets, and David Walker and Elijah Roberts this year, Bucky Irving in the 4th round, Jalen McMillan in the 3rd round the year before that. You got Trey Palmer at wide receiver in the 6th round. You go back to 2022, it was Cade Otton at tight end, Zion McCollum in the 5th round. You go to 2021, it was KJ Britt, who's now a member of the Dolphins. You go to 2020, it was Tyler Johnson at wide receiver, who took a little bit of time. Khalil Davis has become a reasonable rotational player. Anthony Nelson in 2019. These are players who have a very specific role to fill amidst a roster that had some cornerstones, and you're making picks in that window. And it allows you to go shopping for who are the guys that fit a very specific role. And it gives you a better pathway instead of just saying, we just need to pick players. And that's where I think about a name like Ollie Gordon. And I say, yeah, I think Ollie Gordon might be a thing. That's where I look at a name like Malik Washington as a special teams and slot guy. I think he can be a thing. And Jalen Wright, same thing. Right? But you have to be able to pick by volume to do that. And for the Dolphins to surrender the way in which they did so much for 3 players that all cost between $22 and $30 million per season. I mean, multiple draft picks. Now, the Jalen Ramsey one is a little bit less of a right on the nose cost, because it was a 3rd round pick in Hunter Long, who you didn't really feel like was going to be a thing at that point. But you can contrast that to the Bradley Chubb trade, for example. Miami sent a 1st round pick with a 4th round pick and Chase Edmonds for Chubb and a 5th round pick that cashed this year. Right, so it's a 2023 1, a 2024 4, and Edmonds. And then the Dolphins would go ahead to trade for Jeff Wilson as the replacement for Chase Edmonds, but a 1 and a 4 for Bradley Chubb, really, and a future 5. And then you pair that with the Tyreek Hill trade and the assets that went to Kansas City as a part of that. 5 draft picks in total. The slate of picks was the number 29 overall pick in the 2022 NFL draft, the 50th overall pick in the NFL draft, a 4th round pick in the NFL draft, and then 4th and 6th round picks in 2023. Those are a lot of bites at the apple. And there's times where that talent allocation is appropriate. But when you take that and you parlay that with all the opportunity costs for other players to bring into the mix or potentially trading down out of that spot, and then you add on top of that, from a culture perspective, what Tyreek Hill has and has not been for you, what Jalen Ramsey has and has not been for you, and what Bradley Chubb couldn't be for you because he wasn't on the field last year. It all adds up. And that's why I think a role player, hyper-focused, not crazy, exorbitant free agency spending plan this year, and a focus on young players that are impressionable for you to dictate to them, this is the right way to do things, and you are mature enough to go about your business, was the only right step I think the Dolphins could take. I can't guarantee it's going to work, and I can't guarantee the Dolphins are going to win enough game that they're not going to make seismic changes when it's all said and done anyway. But it's a much better plan in my mind than throwing a bunch of cash at the problem, because that's what this team, when the cards have been down and your back's been against the wall, you've been covering up problems for quite some time. And then they tried something new in 2019. They got an amazing start to it. They got a nice foundation going, and then they lost the plot. Here's hoping that there's a commitment to it, that they see the tangible results, and it gives them the belief that they need to stay to it for the next life cycle of the team. That's going to do it for us here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys as always for checking the show. Make it a great rest of your day. I'll be back again tomorrow for some more Miami Dolphins football content coming your way. Hope to see you then. Go Fins.